Experimental figures are at the heart of scientific papers. So much so that authors, when they're writing a paper, will typically start by laying out the figures that they have and crafting a story around those figures. The figures themselves should actually be able to tell the story, and so figures and their legends or their captions should be able to stand alone from the paper that they actually go with. And when you're experienced in science and reading scientific articles, often what you do is you just actually skim through the figures before you actually dive into the text. And sometimes that tells you whether you want to dive into the text, and sometimes it tells you all you need without diving into the text. The figure legend itself needs to have all of the information that allows the reader to interpret the figure without having to go back and looking at that text, which is great because often the figures are actually going to be freely accessible even if the paper is not. And so often when you go to the website or you go to PubMed or whatever, you can see the figures and you might even be able to access like the figure viewer and stuff, even when you can't access the text. So that's great because these figures have so much information in them. But the amount of information in them can make them hard to interpret. And so here are some kind of helpful hints, hopefully, for helping you interpret the figures and their legends, as well as for helping you craft these figure legends when you're making them for yourself and designing your figures. Typically, the first sentence of the figure legend is going to have kind of the key takeaway of the figure. So it serves as like a figure title, it's in bold, and it has some sort of like statements like protein X is associated with blah, and it might even say like as shown in this type of acid or whatever. And so basically your first sentence is often going to be that kind of takeaway message from the figure, and then you have more information about, say, different panels within the figure. Speaking of panels, sometimes there's a ridiculous number of panels and figures these days. So again, the figure legend, the caption, and the figure together. That needs to be able to stand alone from the rest of the article. This means that there's going to be a lot of information in that legend, or at least there should be. You don't want it to be super, super long and stuff. Sometimes they're super duper long, but you want to kind of only include the information that the reader needs to interpret that figure, but you need to include all of the information that the reader needs in order to interpret the figure. This means that if you're using any acronyms or the author is using any acronyms, they need to be defined in that figure legend. Except for cases where it's things like RNA and DNA, where it's generally recognized as convention, and often there's actually, when authors are drafting their papers, there's the style guide, and the journal authors say, okay, well, these words are okay to abbreviate without defining, but other words, you gotta define them. Sometimes they're defined just kind of as they're used in the figure legend, and sometimes they're in a list at the end. But they need to be there even if they were also in the article, because it's got to stand alone from the article. You also, though, want to avoid using too many abbreviations, and sometimes people use abbreviations when it's not really necessary. And abbreviations can mean totally different things in totally different contexts, and so that's why you need to define the abbreviation in your figure legend. Unfortunately, when people see a figure, often one of their first kind of instincts is to go Google if they have a question about like, oh, what does that stand for? You want to be careful with that because you'll see there's like a bunch of different things it could stand for, but if you want to know what it does stand for, that information should be in your figure legend. Whenever possible, you should add labels to the figure itself rather than just relying on the reader going to that figure legend. So you want to take the work out of the reader when they're trying to interpret your figure. You don't want them having to go back and forth between the legend and the figure. So adding those labels directly to the figure, maybe the first time you use a thing in the figure, you actually have the abbreviation in the figure itself, and then you also have it in your legend. But these sorts of things are going to make it easier for your reader to follow along without having to go back and forth. But at least then they're going back and forth between the figure and the legend rather than between the figure and the paper. Because again, everything that is in the figure needs to be understandable by just having the legends and not by having the main text of the article. It also needs to define the line coloring and styles, and hopefully these styles are consistent throughout the paper. That's kind of best practice. Trying to make things easier for your reader to follow along, you want to use a consistent coloration scheme in different panels in the same figure and in different figures throughout the paper. And those coloration schemes and the line styles and things need to be in the legend. Ideally, these will be in a format that is going to be colorblind friendly, as well as black and white printing friendly. And so often you'll see different kind of line styles used, maybe different widths, different shapes of the markers. All of these things can be used to help the reader kind of follow along. And sometimes there's also kind of like a little key for the symbols for the line styles and stuff in the figure itself. And if you're making a figure, that's a really great idea if there's space for that, because then the reader doesn't have to be going back and forth between the figure and the figure legend, figure legend, figure legend. Hopefully the authors will have followed these kind of conventional guidelines of using the consistent formatting throughout. You need to include enough of the methods that the reader can interpret things without having to go and look and dig through all the methods. Sometimes you have to go and look at another figure, so it'll say like coloration or methods performed as in figure blah blah, and then you go to the other figure to see it, but hopefully it's in at least one of those figure legends, especially because these days the methods are often all the way in the supplemental section, and then yeah, it's a nightmare. But hopefully those legends are not a nightmare and they include enough information for you to interpret the figure. So again, this includes abbreviations. It includes any like shortening forms of words you use. It includes coloration, line styles, anything like that. It also should include what, if there are like error bars, are those standard deviations? Are those standard error the means? What's your replicate size? So you might see like n equals, and that tells you how many replicates there were. If there are statistical tests performed, often the statistical significance level will be indicated with an asterisk. And so it will have like an asterisk, and then it'll say P less than blah blah, and then P less than blah blah, and P less than blah blah, and you might see like an NS for a not significant difference or whatever. And all of that should be defined in the figure legend, in addition to using those symbols in the figure. When you're making a figure, you want to align the axes, align the squares and things, distribute things out. If you're using a tool like Adobe Illustrator, or you're using a free version, something like Inkscape, there are tools that you can use in order to make sure that things are in a line, and that's going to help make your work look more polished. You also want to be careful when you're resizing things that you're not squishing things, and so always be dragging with like the shift or whatever from the corners. Make sure you're not messing with the aspect ratio. A pet peeve of mine is when you have like squished figures, like, anyway, make sure that it's legible, make sure that things are formatted, things are polished looking, you make good use of your space, you don't have like everything crunched up here and then a big white space, things are aligned. If there's text, it's legible. Any labels, anything like this, the text is big enough for people to read and it's aligned and all that nice stuff. Any sort of coloration, any sort of line styles, error bars, all of this information needs to be in the figure legend. If you have a question about the figure, like, oh, what does that abbreviation stand for? What's that symbol? Well, that information should be in the figure legend or the caption. And so make things easier for your reader, make your work look polished. All of this stuff is going to then help minimize the effort on the behalf of the reader, and it's going to help you portray the story as you are crafting your paper and things. You want to make sure too, when you're writing a paper, when you're writing a figure legend, that you are correctly referencing what figure and what figure part things are. And so this can get kind of jumbled up when you're changing the formatting of things in your paper. So you just want to double check that. In terms of how you number these things, you want to number them in the order in which you actually talk about them in the paper. So although this stands alone from the paper, it should be able to stand alone from the paper. It's associated with the paper, and so the paper is kind of then the author is giving you more information about how they generated the figure, about their interpretations of the figure, all of these various things. And then they're going to be citing that figure throughout the paper. And often it'll be like, just instead of saying like, in figure blah blah, we show that, it'll be something like, this is associated with this, parentheses, figure 1A, but not this, figure 1B, as opposed to figure 2, that sort of thing. Although sometimes they do like kind of more explicitly state the figure as opposed to just citing it. But it needs to be cited at least once in the paper, typically. And it needs to be cited in the order in which it's numbered. And so if you cite this figure first, that figure better have a figure 1. And if you change the order of things, you want to make sure you change the order of the things in your paper. And so there are tools that you can use and things to like put little placeholders so that it'll change as you move things around. But regardless, if you're using one of those, you still want to go at the end, make sure that everything in your text is actually consistent with what's in the figures. Be careful too when you're doing figures that if you're copying and pasting things from different parts, all of that information is actually consistent with what's in the figure. And so you want to make sure that you double check all of these things before you submit your thing, before you publish your findings, whatever. So to review, the figures and the figure legends are at the heart of scientific papers. They should be able to tell the story of the article without you needing to actually go read the article. And so scientists, when we get really good at reading papers and when we get really experienced, then you often kind of just go to the figures and you read through the figures before you even decide if you want to read the paper. And you might do it before you read the paper in order to see if the author's interpretations of things agree with your interpretation of the data. But gaining familiarity with papers and with experiments and all these things takes a lot of time and practice. And so the key is to start getting some practice. And as you get some practice, a helpful thing to do is to kind of look and see where that figure has been cited in the paper. And so you might search for like figure X or fig X. So Command Control F is your friend. Find where that figure is talked about in the paper. And that is then going to help you kind of interpret the figure potentially. And then later on, when you're just looking at the figures and stuff, you can go and see where it's talked about specifically in the paper. Assuming you have access to the paper. Because again, often you have access to the figures, even when you don't have access to the paper. But hopefully too, you can then get access to the paper through your library or something like this. Hopefully this helps. And again, practice is key, whether it comes to reading these figures or to writing them.